let's have a chat about the World Wide Web. New Year, new resolutions. All but one of the world's 54 nations can now begin trading from South Korea and the United States thanks to the opening of the world's largest single market. We'll talk about ways to improve technological industries' economic partnerships. This action is meant to aid developing nations and counter China's efforts to influence emerging economies by making large-scale investments there. There will be a dramatic uptick in the use of the currencies of friendly nations. Hello and welcome to Financial Fortune, your go-to channel for all things related to finance, investments, and the economy. In today's video, we'll be discussing the end of globalization and the reasons behind this phenomenon. With rising economic nationalism and geopolitical tensions, many experts are predicting a shift away from globalization and towards a more fragmented global economy.
Bridges have been built for more than 4,000 years, linking regions together and opening routes for trade and people to pass through. From humble brick arches to mega concrete structures, they've all played a role in globalization. Supporters of globalization argue that improvements in communication and transportation have created a more open, tolerant and peaceful world. In the last 100 years, it has resulted in huge growth for global trade, as economies, people and cultures gradually integrated. But globalization hasn't been without its drawbacks, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has helped to push international relations to a breaking point.
The worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession.
Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas's warning from the IMF's World Economic Outlook in October 2022 underlined the significant slowdown in the global economy and the reliance on global trade to function. It's raised questions as to whether the many benefits of globalization outweigh the geopolitical problems it's helped create.
Globalization has delivered. That's the first thing we should realize. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's allowed the rise of emerging markets. It's on the back of a process of integration into the global economy. So in many ways, it has succeeded.
The roots of that success, according to historians, dates as far back as the 1st century BC to the old Silk Road. It transported luxury goods such as gold, silver, and of course silk between China and Rome, the two great civilizations at the time. Then came the spice trade as Islamic merchants dominated the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean sea routes. By the end of the 15th century, the age of discovery had begun, and with it, the slave trade. The appalling exploitation of African people helped European explorers conquer and integrate new territories, such as the Americas, into their economies. But these new trade links weren't truly global. The first wave of globalization really began at the end of the 18th century, with the British Industrial Revolution, which, through improved manufacturing and transportation, saw huge growth in global exports. The two world wars ushered in a new era dominated by the United States with the help of new technologies like the car and the plane. Then came the digital revolution, which turbocharged globalization to new frontiers as China joined the US as the two global powers. But the latest wave of globalization has seen a lot of pushback. As a result of technological advances, whole industries have been wiped out, causing mass job losses. Worker exploitation and a rise in inequality have also been, at least partly, attributed to globalization.
There are a number of people who have been suffering as the economy is changing, and how some local labor markets are facing competition from overseas and things like that. So these kinds of dislocations happened.
Has globalization gone too far?
In some ways, globalization has gone too far.
Kevin Gallagher is an economist and director of the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University.
You know how stock markets have bubbles, and then there's a correction. I think there's been a globalization bubble, and we're trying to correct it. We've spent so much time almost thinking about like the globalization of markets and trade as an ends, rather than a means to help us live in a more stable, more equal, and more environmentally sound way.
We have to find better ways in which we can make sure that everyone is going to be benefiting going forward. And that's part of the reason why there is so much resentment, is that in a sense, a lot of people feel like this is a train that left them behind. And so why should they vote for a process that has not benefited them?
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has, in Garincha's opinion, revealed underlying geopolitical tectonic plates. Imagine the two countries are tectonic plates that rub up against each other to create an earthquake. That earthquake has had a ripple effect on other tectonic plates. Think rising commodities prices, disrupted trade, a refugee crisis, and weaker economies thanks to central banks raising interest rates at a faster than expected pace. All rifts that have helped push the world's economies apart. Without intervention, these plates would become distinct economic blocks, with trade, currency, and political systems that could unravel our current global economic order.
And while the conflict between Russia and Ukraine may be the epicenter of the earthquake, the geopolitical tectonic plates that make up the globalized economy have been drifting apart for years.
Major economies began to drop tariff rates on imports, and many nations entered into free trade agreements following a series of events after the Second World War, including a meeting in 1944 between 44 countries and the fall of the Soviet Union. But over the last 10 years, the backlash against globalization has fueled populist movements all around the world, which in many cases led to protectionist policies. Protectionism is the economic policy of restricting imports to shield a country's domestic industries from foreign competition. Data from Global Trade Alert show that protectionist trade policy interventions have been growing faster than liberalizing ones.
The rise of China and other emerging market economies came about largely thanks to globalization, but this growing economic power may also be contributing to its fragmentation.
China's been one of the largest beneficiaries of globalization. When it entered the WTO, it really grew it in an incredible amount. And it really allowed the rest of the world to grow because we had lower prices. But while China adhered to the letter most of the time of our international trade rules, but they played a stronger role with their state to make sure that they produced a lot of things at home and moved into the new sectors of the future in ways that markets won't do on their own.
Back in 2018, President Donald Trump accused China of unfair trading practices and intellectual property theft, and began to slap tariffs on China to encourage US consumers to buy American products. China hit back with its own tariffs and accused the US of trying to prevent it from becoming the world's dominant economic power.
Being a large economic power comes great responsibilities. And I think by and large, the Chinese authorities are very cognizant of that. Global discussions are taking place. That needs to continue, that needs to be reinforced. And we need to get past sort of the tensions that might be arising. There is a rebalancing of economic power and governance that is taking place. We've had this slow process over the last 40 years, the rise of emerging markets. As their economic power increases, there is a need for an adjustment in the way we address and deal with global problems. And so it was bound to happen that there would be little rifts and, the plates would start moving apart.
According to Garinchas, the rise in these countries' economic might was not matched by a similar rise in their financial and global institutional firepower. That's in part down to the dominance of the US dollar, but the US's share of global output is likely to decline due to the growth in emerging markets.
We're coming out from a period where we had very strong dominance from one country and groups of countries. But we have to plan and organize a transition to this multipolar world.
A multipolar world is one where there are more than two centers of power. In theory, it would allow emerging economies to better retain and protect the benefits of globalization. But whether the US and China, the world's superpowers, would agree to that transition is unclear.
This is complicated. This is difficult. This is, there's a new seat at the table. And so how we organize this in a way that is beneficial for everyone is really the challenge that we're facing.
And as these hypothetical tectonic plates move away from each other, Garinchas argues we'll need more bridges between them, not less. Bridges like the IMF.
A core mission of the IMF is to guarantee that we have global financial stability. And so it's really important to keep as many countries around the table and to find ways to reach agreements. And a world that sort of, we don't trade, we don't engage, we don't talk, we can't do any of this.
But Gallagher begs to differ.
The IMF on some levels has really been a big part of the problem when it comes to globalization. They say raise taxes, cut spending, raise the interest rate, put the country into a short-term recession, and hope that the investment community will see that you've tightened your belt and money will start to trickle in. That doesn't pay off so well.
What are the key areas that need to be corrected for the global economy to move forward?
Number one is financial markets. Financial system is sort of feeds on itself rather than fuels productive, equal, and environmentally sound development. We really need to regulate global finance to make sure that it's aligned with our broader societal goals. Number two, make sure that there's safety nets so that all the benefits just don't accrue to a small amount of folks. And the populism that comes with that makes folks want to close borders and go to war.
Globalization refers to the increasing integration of national economies, cultural practices, and individual lives around the globe. This is due to the free movement of capital, goods, services, information, and people across national borders. Over the course of many decades, governments around the world have established economic partnerships to ease the flow of people and goods, and the term globalization is used to describe the entire interconnected system of this global flow. As a result, the world is becoming a much smaller place, with less distinction between its various parts, geographically, culturally, economically, and institutionally. Humans have been exploring new territories and blending their culture with that of the locals since the beginning of time. Globalization took shape and economic cooperation among nations increased with the advent of steamships, railroads, the telegraph, and other technological breakthroughs. After World War II, the United States led efforts to revive international trade and investment, and this is where globalization truly took shape. Amidst a global reorganization, with the United States policing the oceans and reorganizing international trade under newly negotiated rules, globalization took its current form, creating a world where everything is seamlessly integrated. The goal was and is to make the world a better place where nations work together to ensure lasting peace and prosperity for all. If every country contributes what it can, international trade of goods, services, and resources becomes possible. This has been successful for decades, making countries richer and improving their standard of living. Countries like China and India have benefited greatly from globalization, both economically and politically. China has essentially become the factory of the world, with virtually all manufactured goods now passing through the country. And that includes the pair of denim pants you're wearing right this minute. But why is globalization coming to an end? Providing it continues to look this good, that is. Now we get to the interesting part. To put an end to the conflict in Ukraine, the two leaders issued a joint statement on Tuesday. For the first time ever, UN ruble trade was higher than ruble trade in dollars. According to Beijing, this is the strongest relationship between the two countries. China and Russia are taking a stand against the US-defined and manipulated international order. Under American leadership, globalization began in the late 1940s, and from that point on, the United States selected its members. The United States would reinstate trade relations with any nation that severed ties to the Soviet Union. It was at this time that the Cold War erupted. As diplomatic ties strengthened, this restriction was lifted. Recently, however, Russia's aggression toward Ukraine has reignited the conflict and caused new sides to be drawn. The situation is exacerbated because, unlike the 1940s, China is also a major superpower. War and other geopolitical tensions are a major driving force behind the demise of globalization. It appears that the West is advocating for a breakaway from China and Russia, which will cause a splintering of global trade and financial flows as countries choose sides. Some regions and nations are so interdependent on others that the breakdown of any single component threatens to bring down the whole structure. That's why people on continents and in countries thousands of miles away could feel the impact of the Ukrainian war. Now, don't take my words as if I'm trying to downplay Ukraine's plight by pointing to the higher price of wheat on the international market. No, I'm emphasizing the global impact of Russian sanctions and Ukrainian restrictions. Russia's current involvement in the conflict means that any country that chooses to form an alliance with it will be put in the same position as Belarus. Because of Russia's decision to side with the West in this war, the West has effectively cut off Russia from global trade. China's consistent non-military support for Russia makes it the most menacing of the allies. Just recently, I documented President Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow for talks with Putin on trade and peace, with the emphasis on the former. The West has taken note of China's support for Russia and has even threatened sanctions against the country if it continues to help Russia. Vice President Joe Biden of the United States recently expressed concern over the potential consequences should China provide Russia with material support. China's response was ambiguous at best, but it was clear that it opposed broad, untargeted sanctions as harmful to global trade. The consequences of Russia's expulsion from the Globalization Forum are bad, but those of expelling China would be catastrophic. When it comes to the global economy, China is one of, if not the most, central players, due to its abundance of low-cost factories and skilled workers. The removal of China from the global economy would have severe consequences for all parties involved, to an even greater extent than Russia. China is the transit point for a vast array of goods, from textiles to electronics, and this is not an industry that can be replaced quickly. We learned this the hard way from China and their zero-COVID policy. The world came to a halt when China closed its borders during the COVID period. With supply lines severed and production at a standstill, many companies with Chinese factories were unable to recover. The fact that China and Russia are banding together to oppose the United States and Western Europe is, well, problematic. The United States and its allies are increasingly at odds with China, Russia, and their allies, and the world is becoming more and more divided as a result. The risk is that there will be no winners in such a situation, only disruptions that make everyone's lives more difficult. The end of globalization can be attributed in large part to geopolitical factors. What was once a unified, all-encompassing system of trade and partnership is fragmenting into a chaotic mess as different nations choose sides. All right, follow along. Much of today's globalization has contributed to the world's unequal rate of development. Modern globalization has resulted in the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, whereas true globalization is meant to benefit all nations that participate in the marketplace. Even in places where progress has been made, it pales in comparison to what has been accomplished in the industrialized world. The colonization of Latin America, Africa, and India by Europeans may have been the inspiration for the modern concept of globalization. Therefore, much like the prevailing style of the time, when major world powers like England and Spain exploited the wealth of resources available in new territories, we now have what we call globalization, which is in most parts merely exploitation. There is a poor path dependency because developing countries are exploited for the benefit of large, stable countries. It's clear from this that globalization hinders economic growth everywhere it goes because it sets poor countries on a path to development that they can't easily abandon. It's the equivalent of starting a reliance where your expansion is limited. There is a ceiling beyond which your success is impossible to extend. It is still visible to this day. In the name of globalization, many African countries have fallen into a debt trap with China. The larger economies receive the lion's share, if not all of the benefits, and the smaller economies accept whatever they can get. Furthermore, there are repercussions for showing ungratefulness for this form of exploitation. Simply put, the developed world has been encouraged by globalization to exploit the resources of the underdeveloped world, leading to uneven development on a global scale. You can use that as a headline if you like, but it's important to remember that the effects of globalization aren't always visible abroad. Sometimes it's necessary to take a look within economies to see where the weaknesses are. Consider the United States as an illustration of this. Well, allow me to elaborate. While I agree that there may be temporary setbacks, I don't think that, in the medium to long term, globalization will be eradicated altogether, as is the spirit of many such forecasts. These are the words of Ezequiel Hernandez, a professor of management at the Wharton School. He thinks it would take more than a war between two countries to destabilize global trade and finance. The globalization world order has been thrown into disarray due to the Ukrainian invasion. Simply put, his point is that the global community has become too interdependent. Now, picture a world where people have severed all ties with each other. Each country and business needs the other. No nation can serve as its own customer base and supply chain anymore. Companies can only ensure the reliability of their supply chain, expand their customer base, find skilled and unskilled labor, and meet the needs of the public by trading with others and expanding their operations beyond national borders. The reality of the world is like that today. Hernandez continued by saying that the home market is not a sizable enough market for most moderately sized businesses. This necessitates a focus on international customers. That means shifting towards supply chains that span multiple countries or regions. That's an undeniable fact that's difficult to deny. The world is a small, interconnected community with no easy way out. Hernandez is just one of many who argue that the world's interconnectedness isn't so pervasive as to be harmful. That's all for today's video on financial fortune. We hope you found this information useful and informative. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay up to date on the latest news and trends in the world of finance. Thanks for watching.